Hello everybody, this is Stories from the Fringe. I'm Chris. Today I've got for you an audio-only collection of Dogman encounters. These Dogman encounters are pretty strange. In my opinion, they're not werewolves, because that's just a little bit ridiculous. And to my mind, the idea of a cryptid population of undiscovered Dogman-like creatures also seems a little bit ridiculous. So what are people seeing then? Because there are quite a few reports of these things, and they do seem to be actual physical beings of some sort. They certainly deserve to be in the high strangeness category. But anyway, enough yapping from me. Here we go. Dogman encounters. I hope you enjoy them. A blood-chilling scavenger. One night in September 2005, I was driving home from work at around 11:30 p.m. I was a waitress at a golf course in a fairly rural area of Michigan. Thus, the shortest distance between work and home was all back roads. As I turned onto the road that I lived on, I saw what I thought was a bear. It was digging through the trash that had been set out in front of a house with a very long driveway. It was most likely the length of the driveway that had caused the owner to set up a yard light, which was directly above the quote-unquote bear. I was initially excited. I had grown up in the area, and people often swore there were bear, but I had never gotten to see one. Plus, it just so happened to be under the only light that was on that road. My car slowed to a stop, and I realized immediately that it wasn't a bear. I wasn't afraid yet, but it was shaped all wrong to be a bear. Plus the fur was short and shiny, like a horse's or a Doberman's. The car rolled to a stop. I had already seen enough to know that it wasn't a bear, or a canine, or even a cat or a deer. It was just shaped all wrong. It was hugely muscled. As it dug, I could see the muscles moving in its strangely humanoid shoulders. I'm very confused by now, but I'm still expecting to have a light bulb realization. It was huge, the shoulders very human and strong, but it hasn't looked up yet, so I just kept staring, figuring that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had been at a full stop for at least 10 seconds surely, before it finally looked up, and it was like time stopped. This is the part of the story I hate to tell for two reasons. One, even after all this time, I still get goosebumps when I think about it. And two, I know that it sounds crazy. The face was hideous, blood-chilling, terror-inducing. It wasn't flat like a man's, but not long like a dog's either. It had some sort of an elongated face, and a flattened, pushed-up nose, and eyes that glowed red with what I swear was their own light, not reflected light. The only light source was my headlights, which were pointed down the road, and the yard light, which was above it. And the glow wasn't your standard animal eye shine. It was like the colour of a hot electric burner. The mouth was by far the worst of it. It was massive. Think anglerfish style, only the teeth were larger, broader, and weirdly shining, almost metal-looking. I just stared at it, forcing myself to keep looking, knowing any moment that I would realize that it was a mask or a trick of the light. Then it started to stand, bipedal like a man. It opened that terrifying mouth in what was clearly an act of aggression, and then I floored it. My car fishtailed, and I had a moment of terror as I realized that if I went into the ditch, it would just be me and the werewolf. Thankfully, it got under control, and I didn't look back. Werewolf was what my brain was screaming, but I'm not sure. Michigan is Dogman country, but no one has ever described him as having a pushed-in nose and a mouth like an anglerfish all full of shiny teeth. When I got home, a lousy 2 miles away, I drove my car directly up to my porch steps and bolted inside. Thankfully, I have since left the state and have never seen anything like that again. Bipedal Canine. Several years ago in Missouri, I was driving on a deserted road, lined by thick trees. It was just myself and my then 3-year-old son. I saw a silhouette in the distance, right on the edge of the road, and I slowed down, thinking it was a deer, and that it may run out into my path. As I got closer, I could see more detail. I realized it was a dog, a big dog, sitting on its haunches. Its head would have easily cleared the height of my waist. I continued slowing on approach, partly in case it chose to bolt onto the road, and partly in an attempt to see more detail. What kind of dog was this? A family member used to groom dogs, and I became quite familiar, but this one was new to me. I remember it had dark, shaggy, tangly, thick fur that stuck out rather than lying flat. But that's all the detail I was allowed, because as my car approached this dog, it stood on its hind legs. I could see the canine-style hip shape in the moments before it ran on its hind legs, surprisingly nimble in spite of the leg shape, which should have prevented the ability to run. It sprinted the few yards between the road and the forest, and disappeared into the trees as my car passed. Naturally, I sped up out of fear for me and my son. Thankfully, I have never since seen anything of the like. Upright dog in the farmland. This happened to my youngest daughter, as she visited a friend in the southern part of the country. Just after midnight, the 4 girls and 2 parents were in the living room. Suddenly the father calls out for the others to come to the window and have a look at some animal out in the field. This is farmland, with lots of open fields surrounded by forest. It was clear weather and nearly full moon, so they could see the animal very well at a distance. It looked like a big dog or a wolf. Then a car approached on a nearby road, and as it came closer, the animal got up on its hind legs and ran off at an impossible speed into the woods. Nobody in the area had ever heard of any animal that could do that, and it was definitely not a human being. Creepy as hell, even if you're safe inside a house. Supernatural dog-like beast. This isn't my story, but the story of one of my dearest friends. I trust this person implicitly, and would put my life in his hands if it came down to that. He is completely trustworthy, and one of those people who is completely open with everyone, and wouldn't even think of confabulating intentionally. He is very sane and mentally stable, has a family, etc. This took place in South Dakota. South Dakota is a pretty large area, so by not being more specific than that, I feel I am adequately protecting his identity. Anyway, this is the story he told me. This happened in an extremely remote area. He was out walking with a shotgun for protection, because the area was remote enough that wild animal attacks were not unheard of. There was a very large field behind a thick, forested area, behind which was a fence high enough that it would be at least marginally difficult for an athletic adult, human, to scale. As he headed toward the tree line, he suddenly had an overwhelming sense, and even a mental picture, of a terrifying creature slinking around behind the fence. He felt like he shouldn't go over there, but he's the kind of person who can be sort of defiant toward his own fear, and basically made himself go and have a look, regardless of his intuition. Suddenly, the exact creature he had seen in his mind's eye leaped over the fence to stand in the field before him, standing on 2 legs like a person, and stared him down. He described the creature as being black and hairy, with a solid abdomen, no tapering like a person, just straight down the trunk to the hips, and long arms with what appeared to be claws. The head was somewhat like a wolf or a dog, with an elongated snout and ears like a bear. It stood on its hind legs for several minutes, staring at him, and its eyes held a human-like intelligence and acknowledgement. It was roughly 4.5 feet in height. He felt very afraid and thought to himself that he would shoot it if it approached, But as soon as he had this thought, his mind was flooded with imagery and information that essentially boiled down to, quote, "Your gun is meaningless. You won't even get off one shot. If I want to kill you, you will die. There is nothing you can do about it. No one will ever find out what happened to you." Close quote. This terrified him, and he remembers being incredibly disturbed by this, because he was a human being with a gun, and this thing was what surely had to simply be some sort of animal, except it didn't look or act like an animal. After a minute or two, it vaulted like a human going over a pole vault beam, back over the fence, using one hand to propel itself like a person might, and then it seemed to land on its 2 feet and run away at a high speed in a bipedal fashion. He has, for a decade or more now, looked at every photo of every animal anyone could think of that could describe this, including diseased and sick animals. None of them even came close to looking like what he saw. No one else in the area ever saw it, and he has never returned to the location, citing an overwhelming fear that he was not wanted there. Stalked in the UK. I saw what can only be described as a wolf-like creature years ago in a wooded area close to Aberystwyth in the UK. Me and a friend were walking in the woods years ago. We were probably about 12 or 13, and I'm 30 now, and we had an overwhelming sense that something didn't want us there. We got pretty unsettled and decided to walk back towards the town. As we were walking down the path, we both stopped and looked back at the same time. We didn't hear anything behind us, more sensed it. When we looked back, we could see something moving very quickly through the bushes, probably moving about as fast as a human could run, but this was thick undergrowth, dotted with gorse bushes, and there was no way a human could have run through it at that speed. We both turned around again and sped up. At this point there was an unspoken agreement that we felt if we kept calm, we would be fine, but if we panicked and ran, whatever it was would start to chase us. After a couple of minutes of speed walking down the path as quickly as we could, we were within sight of the town, so we stopped and had a bit of a nervous giggle about the situation. We both turned again, fully expecting to see nothing behind us. Standing probably about 100 feet away from us, on the path, was something that looked very similar to what your friend described. It stood perfectly still facing us. Although it was too far away to see any facial expression, I was absolutely sure that it was staring straight at us. I would guess that it was at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It had wolf or bear-like features, with a thick trunk and long arms. This was the point that we decided running was probably a good idea after all, and so we absolutely legged it, and didn't stop until we were in the town centre and safe. The English Dogman. The sighting happened about 20 years back in a suburb of Birmingham, England, called Kings Norton. My friend, who we will call Dave, was around 22 years old, and he relayed the story to me about 2 years after it happened. Dave was a very straight chap, not at all interested in mysteries or paranormal topics, UFOs, etc., and he was well known for his honesty. He knew that I was interested in such matters, and one night told me he wanted to share something he hadn't talked about with anyone before. His story starts with him coming home from a night out with friends in Birmingham city centre. Although he had been drinking, he stresses he was not drunk and had a clear head. He got off the night service bus at Kings Norton Green and decided to cut through a large playing field which sits opposite the cemetery at the green. So he cut through to the canal at the bottom, which would have cut about half an hour off his walk home. It was a clear night with the moon providing a fair amount of light, but it was very cold. He started to walk along the path which runs along the edge of the field linking to a small road before you reach the canal that runs into a main road. After walking about a quarter of the length, he glanced to his left and saw a very tall man walking parallel with him across the other side of the field. He estimated that the guy was about 7 to 8 feet tall, which made him look a little more carefully. And whilst still walking, he noticed to his surprise that the guy had what appeared to be the head in the shape of an Alsatian dog. At first he thought maybe it was a mask of some sort, but as he looked, he could see the creature's breath coming from its snout, as it was very cold. And there seemed to be a fluid movement as it walked, not the stiff neck you'd expect from a mask placed over a man's head. The creature was wearing a long, dark coat and never looked in Dave's direction. Dave panicked a little at this point. His exact phrase was, his ass was chewing toffee, and decided to speed up his pace, which he did. He glanced again to his left and was alarmed to see that the dog-headed man had matched his pace, but stayed on a parallel course. He stayed calm and continued his brisk walk, observing the dog-headed man from the corner of his eye. If the thing changed its direction, he would run, but he still hoped it was all a bad dream or a hoax. At the bottom, instead of crossing the brook that runs along the base of the field leading to the canal, he cut right, up the small road. Just before he reached the road, he broke into a sprint and looked fully at the dog-headed man to see what it would do. It kept pace with him, but it didn't appear to be running, and still maintaining its parallel course. It stepped over the brook like you would a small puddle, at which time Dave had to turn his back, making the sprint to the main road. He said that was the worst part, imagining that this thing was right at his back. At last he reached the main road with a fair bit of traffic to build his confidence, and turned to see if this thing had followed him. It was nowhere to be seen. Unnatural canine creature. Back around 20 years ago, I was visiting my great-uncle in the region around Kerrville, Texas. At the time, he was living in his first house in the area, before he moved to a retirement community, near a small set of trees. The trees were beautiful, really, as is the hill country. I was staying with him and my great-aunt for about a week, when we went out for an evening to walk his dachshund, as we generally tended to do in the evenings. The walk was uneventful as the sun set. Just a normal evening, complete with the calls of doves and other wildlife, and the dog just having a wonderful time. Then, suddenly, all of the wildlife went deafeningly silent, and both of us froze, as did the dog. I remember having a distinct sense of unease and fear that I could not quite explain, and the dog looking directly in a specific area near a streetlight, my eyes turning to where the dog was looking. There was a creature loping through there, a dog-like thing, about the size of a large Labrador dachshund hybrid, save that on the creature's neck there was a head the size of a bear, and the thing was loping up and down, in a way that fitted that kind of build. It looked hypnotic in a sense, and I was more terrified than I have ever been with anything else that I've ever seen. The head was so massive that it dragged the body down with it when it moved. It had a very fluid aspect to the motion at the same time, and that dissonance is what made it hypnotic. It gave me a visceral understanding of Lovecraft's idea that things that just look fundamentally wrong are terrifying, precisely because the proportions do not fit. That thing was powerfully built, too. The upper limbs in particular were very stout, and the dog remained frozen for another few minutes before we moved back to the house. I'm not sure precisely what that was, or if it was a Dogman, but it convinced me that something like that could exist. The sudden silence that lasted for a few minutes after I left, and the dog just being frozen without even growling or barking, still sends chills in me when I remember it. Evil beast watches from the trees. I work in real estate, or more exactly, commercial real estate, so my work takes me all over the place, from urban industrial areas to very off-the-beaten path, secluded areas, farmlands, development lands, etc. On this day in particular, in October of 2012, My last assignment of the day was to go out and survey a farmstead near Curiousgal in... My last assignment of the day was to go out and survey an old farmstead near Curiousgal in Haldimand County, about 30 miles south of Hamilton, Ontario. The place had been vacant since the 90s. I arrived in the late afternoon, I'd say around 5:30ish. The place was the last one on a dead-end country road and couldn't be seen from the road. I went up the long driveway and proceeded to do my look over of the place. There were 3 structures: the house, a garage, and a large tool shed. I walked around the front of the house, which was completely boarded up, with no means of seeing inside. Then I proceeded around the far side, toward the other buildings. The shed was basically fallen completely down, but the garage was mostly still completely up. I noticed around the side main door a lot of huge scratches, and the door was like half broken down, but still held shut by a padlock on one side and the middle upper hinge. The bottom part was forced inward, and the door and clapboards around it were covered in these scratches, but not like scratches a dog would leave. These scratches were huge and parallel, but spread apart, almost like fingernail scratches, and very deep, obviously put there with a lot of pressure. That's when I looked down and seen huge paw prints. Not regular round paw prints, almost elongated a little bit. The area around this partially broken down door was covered with these paw prints. If I had to venture a guess at how wide they were, I would say at least 5 inches. I was wearing heeled dress boots, and when I put my foot over the paw print, I could see the print on either side of my foot, and I wear a size 10, so I don't have tiny feet by any means. I began to get very uneasy, and that's when I recalled noticing that all the sounds of the forest were gone. It was dead silent, and that is when I noticed a stench, like wet dog, urine, and feces combined. I mean, the whole area just smelled rotten, like a swamp. Rot and decay. But this smell was strong and very putrid, and I got very uneasy. Like all of a sudden, I knew I wasn't alone. So I decided that I'd seen enough and quickly headed back to my car. That is when I heard something in the bushes, and it sounded big, and it was going through the trees very quickly and hard. I got back to my car, got in, and locked the doors. When I started my car and turned the lights on, that's when I caught eyeshine in the trees ahead of me. But the eyeshine was not at the level of a dog's head. It was a lot higher. I would say 4 to 5 feet up, maybe even a bit higher. I could not make out a shape, as it was getting on towards dusk, and so there was a lot of shadows in the trees. But I thought I seen a large figure in the trees, but I could not be sure. I started to freak out a little bit, and decided it was time to go. So I backed around, right into a wet, marshy spot, and kinda got my car stuck. I was more interested in watching this thing than where I was going, which was a mistake. My attention quickly went back to the car, as I tried to free myself from the mud. When I looked back to where this thing was, it was gone. In the spot where it was, I could see further into the trees, so there was definitely something there before. After several seconds of rocking my car back and forth, I managed to get out, and I left very quickly. I don't think I have ever been so scared in my life. Like I said, I did not clearly see what it was, but I just had the intense feeling of evil. Something bad was there. And that concludes this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the comments and also in the next video, the News from the Fringe video, where I'll speak about these encounters a little bit more.